Yolanda would like to, you can unmute.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I am based in Barbados. I am an urban planner and an environmental planner. And I've been on the forum, on the conference, in and out for the last 4 days. And I'm very impressed with it. Thank you very much for creating the space for people to have this kind of a conversation. In terms of doing more, I think what we need to do a bit more is share experiences across the community. I think like the issue of putting mangroves and natural solutions towards adapting to climate change. There are so many that have been tried already in different islands, different spaces, but we are unaware of it because we do not communicate enough, we do not write enough, we do not have conversations enough. And a lot of these things have been modeled. If you put a hard structure in one place, you don't have to guess whether it's going to impact the coast in another spot. That all of that can be modeled. So all the coastal modeling that can take place is there. So they're engineering, design solutions, and natural solutions. So a lot of these things, the thing is that a lot of it costs money. And a lot of it, I think, is pushed by the fact that we don't have enough engagement from communities. And it affects communities, but communities often are thinking about the immediate and not about the long term. And so you're struggling to live today. And a lot of the things for climate change are about looking at your tomorrow and how are you going to cope next year or 10 years from now? How are your children going to cope if you don't do something now? I actually started to hear these same words I'm hearing this weekend. I've heard 30 years ago when I came into consultancy as an environmental planner. At that time, the then Caribbean Disaster and Emergency Response Agency, now SEDEMA, was very, very, very deeply involved in creating policy across the region to deal with climate change. And climate change was urgent 30 years ago. I have lived to see 30 years later when we are still talking about its urgency and still unable to actually take practical measures to see our communities adapt. And there are several ways to adapt. It doesn't mean giving up your land all the time. In some areas, it can be just redesigning. In some areas, that may mean more vegetation or using some other natural way of dealing with it. But I don't think we have enough conversation. And I think that doing more means having more conversations and getting the resources. Often it's financial, often it's to do with engagement, which takes a long time to get the trust of communities and for them to understand that you really do want to do something better for them. But we need to put more resources into it, put more money behind it, share more stories, and actually pilot a lot more of these projects that we see taking place so people would see what can and cannot happen. And that is my contribution to how we can do it better.
Thank you so much for that. And I agree with you wholeheartedly in terms of the sharing of experiences. And I think we have been able to facilitate some of that through the Caribbean Women for Climate Justice Conference. And I'm particularly proud that we were able to include the experiences of our Indigenous people who have had a long-standing culture of sustainability. And I think they hold some of the keys to us achieving that level of sustainability and resilience. But we definitely need to share more. The learnings that would take place in Jamaica could assist with some of the challenges in Guyana and vice versa. So we really need to maximize the potential of the region through, I always say, partnerships and collaboration, and definitely the exchange of ideas and experiences. So is there anyone else who would like to contribute?
One of the things it's always shocking when we talk about climate migration and it being something that will result. You don't realize that it's already happening. Like in Guyana, that has already happened because I had spent some time at Shell Beach, and that's the beach whereby 4 of our species of sea turtles nest, and it's been eroded. And in the film, we heard the speakers. It used to be a striving community, and if you go there right now, it's probably just about 3 to 4 family that lives there. But we really don't get the coverage. Like that's a really important story because that's removal of people from the land that they knew, that land that they grew up on. But because of this change in climate change, they had to move. And some of them, they depend on that specific area because they farm, they fish, and they're indigenous people. So, taking them from one place to the next, it's extremely difficult. And I don't think that's something in this movie that I've seen highlighted. I haven't seen it anywhere else. But you would think Guyana with such we have so much land, and that can still happen. Climate migrate, you might have to remove yourself from a specific area. That's still something that we can be faced with.
Yeah, and I see Raji's hand is up. You can come in, Raji.
Right. So I think in addition to what Yolanda was saying, what we've been saying, uh, harmonizing with the indigenous communities is paramount. It is incredibly important. As you know, everything in the universe is built up on rhythm. So I tend to think of it like music, even though we started or even though there was a significant push 30 years ago. um, I think now is an appropriate time as well. Now is another gateway. It's almost like playing the drum. You strike the drum at one point, and at a certain point and at a certain point, that is when you hit the beat again. And if everyone does this together, you have a certain resonance. So I think now is the time where we can network, we can we can interconnect because we have all of these devices. We have the internet at our fingertips, we have the awareness, we have a certain kind of charge here, combining all of these elements with the indigenous peoples, women, who are now very well educated and very well charged, and very well close to earth, the nurturers here. I think you guys have an important role to play as well in educating our children, in educating our youth, and as well as creating, just basically forming the cement, and allowing us to get this message out. Uh, Another thing I was thinking, I think including the use of the private sector to create some amount of awareness among people. I heard that said yesterday. I think that's very important as well. And I think that if we do that effectively, we can push legislation. We can go for things like carbon taxes. We can small things like those that create deterrence, because if we have something like a carbon tax that makes it more difficult or more costly for you to drill oil, especially if this is done on spaces where you have specially protected species like mangroves, right? So if we make it more costly for them to disturb these areas, then it's more likely that these areas will be protected. Also, if we have some way of calculating the cost of the future risk, future damage rather. So let us say somebody wants to mine in a particular area, and you let them know that this is environmentally destructive and this is how much it will cost you in the next 20 years. That I think if we're able to do an effective cost analysis, drive up the cost a little bit of them initially, breaking ground in those spaces, things like carbon taxes, we can regionally, if we can group together and push for these kinds of legislations, I think we might be able to make a difference there.
Yeah, essentially, we want to make it less attractive for persons to consider destroying our natural defenses. So some really good points you made there, Reggie.
Right, and it might be even more valuable to keep them, because then we can entertain thoughts like ecotourism. So if we can demonstrate that it is more profitable to keep these things around and more costly for them to destroy it, then I think it will make sense if we go figure.
Yes, I think it's important that we really understand the true value of nature. Yes, Christopher is saying must place value on nature. It's easy to to ascribe value to a barrel of oil, right? We know what the price is on the commodity markets. But what is the value of some mangroves, you know? And it goes so deep because we're seeing where the impacts of climate change is not only damage to our physical infrastructure, that our communities are being displaced. We have climate refugees. Our industries are being affected. So you have economic losses when agriculture fails. But there's also the emotional and mental health impacts, which I observed, you know, from when they interviewed some of the community. That's what I took away in terms of the emotional, the psychological toll of the climate crisis on our people. Any thoughts on that from the audience? And you can use the chat. Yeah, Christopher Chinukwu is saying the value of the loss of the health share beach, the impacts on food and livelihoods. Yes, yes. Psychosocial impacts. Yeah, so when we assess the value of something, you know, we need to think about the full extent, or the full extent of the contribution it makes to our well-being, not just the immediate benefits. So we did have a really good discussion around the movie. I think it's very important that we continue to tell our stories, not just when there's a hurricane that devastates an island, but all the other aspects of the climate crisis. I think it's important that we document it and we use these as tools for educating others to help them really draw the connection between climate change and their day-to-day lives. Another thing is that the sea walls, the point that the sea walls gives our communities a false sense of security. You know, so in a sense, it's like man versus nature. Who's going to win? Who's going to win that battle? So I think Jordan has their hand up. Yes, Jordan, come in, please. You can unmute and speak.
Hey, just to say thank you so much for putting on this event. It's been incredible for the past few days. I just wanted to highlight the importance of our urban environments in tackling this challenge. I think right now we're building in the sort of status quo way. We're building as usual without sort of considering the impacts of climate change on our environments, right? Recently in Kingston, they revamped the development order process and increased the densities. But we're having issues with our water supply and transmission. And for the densities that they've planned for, we don't have enough water resources to supply it. So we're actually designing and planning our way into water scarcity in many ways. I think there's a framework, an urban framework that needs to really think laterally and collaboratively to really assess these problems. I think we're very siloed in how we think about legislation, or how we think about how we're planning and designing our environments. And that's reflected in what I just said about the densities and the water. It's also reflected in several other things in our environment. So I think really attacking or thinking about the framework or structures that sort of automate our environments is an important strategy, and really tackling those pieces of legislation so that, we're planning within realistic expectations of what's going to happen 10, 20, 30 years into the future.
Absolutely. As a region, at the regional level and even at the national level, we should be planning and designing for resilience because it's an established fact that we are facing climate impacts. So whatever we do, whatever we invest in should be with a focus on resilience. And given that, most of our countries, if not all, have signed on to the Paris Agreement, and we have nationally determined contributions to, meet, for example, greenhouse gas emission reductions and to transform our systems. We should ensure that across the board there's a focus on resilience, given that we already seeing the impacts. But yet we still see a lot of construction happening on our coastland. We see the removal of natural defenses. And as you give that example, we see a lack of planning for, planning in a way that works with nature, that takes into account our natural ecosystems. And similarly, based on the concept of this conference, we need planning that is based on resilience, and we need planning that is based on equality. Right? So it's about taking the perspectives of our most vulnerable groups, and different groups will have different vulnerabilities, groups in our urban areas versus groups in our rural areas. And it's about ensuring that all needs are considered in our planning, but definitely the issue of planning is critical. I think when we look at some of our existing infrastructure in the region, you wonder if a lot of planning or any planning went into it. But we have enough knowledge now in terms of whatever we do moving forward. There's enough information, there's enough scientific information and engineering principles that would allow us to integrate resilience. Yes, Raji?
So I like this conversation about urban planning. So what does it look like? Is it a case where we will be building more eco-friendly buildings in terms of adobe, hemp, those kind of, do you know about the adobe structures? They are kind of like they are cross between mud brick and straw, basically. They have the ability to remove carbon, absorb carbon. They are nice and insular, eco-friendly. They don't use things like cement. They don't use things like stone. So they don't. It doesn't cost much. It doesn't emit much carbon during production. So I'm thinking there might be the use of different building materials. There's also something called hemp concrete, where they mix the straw from hemp plants, which hemp grows very, very quickly. And on top of that, hemp has many different uses. You can use it to create rope, you can use it to create paper, you can use it to create oil, and building material, and also clothing. So using materials like those, as I said, it grows very, very quickly. And on top of that, it's a plant, so it removes carbon from the atmosphere. So thinking in ways like these might provide some avenue into balancing the issues that we might have. And like I said, small scale countries like ours, or these small region, these tiny island states, and even Guyana, can benefit from taking this pathway, this developmental pathway, because in order to implement these things in larger countries across Europe and United States, it might be costly, more costly than it is for us. Also, I think we have the climate that lends for it. I'm also thinking of things like having plants growing out of the houses. If your structure is earth-based, then you might be able to plant a fruit tree literally on the house or in the house. And normalizing these kinds of things, having your house produce having your homestead rather, or your house or your living space produce all food you need. Having office spaces produce food, so much food that they can give to the homeless, let us say. These are the things. So people don't need to come to work to buy food. They already have food in the working area. So rethinking the way we approach infrastructure in a radical way, I think, is something that can definitely benefit this region.
Thank you, Reggie. And I definitely agree in terms of rethinking our approach to everything to ensure that resilience is at its core, as well as equality and equity and justice in all forms. So with that, I want to thank everyone who has contributed to this lively discussion around our environmental film. And I think we achieved our objective in forcing us to think about our future, looking at our future. And I think we'll all continue to think about it even after the close of this conference and look for ways to have impact